By the time the war reached North Africa, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had already built a reputation unlike any other German commander. Known for his speed, bold decision-making, and ability to outmaneuver his enemies, Rommel had become one of the most recognizable figures of the war. His leadership during earlier campaigns had shown a pattern: rapid movement, calculated risks, and an instinctive understanding of battlefield dynamics. In the open deserts of North Africa, these qualities gave him a significant advantage. Unlike the dense terrain of Europe, the desert offered space, visibility, and mobility, conditions that suited Rommel's style perfectly. He moved his forces quickly, often striking where the enemy least expected, disrupting supply lines and forcing Allied units into reactive positions. For a time, it worked. British forces found themselves repeatedly pushed back, struggling to respond to a commander who seemed to anticipate their moves before they made them. But even in these early successes, there were signs that the situation was more fragile than it appeared. North Africa was not just a battlefield, it was a logistical challenge on a scale that few fully understood at the time. Every advance Rommel made stretched his supply lines further across the desert, making it increasingly difficult to maintain fuel, ammunition, and equipment. Unlike his opponents, who had access to more stable supply routes through the Mediterranean and the Suez Canal, Rommel depended on long, vulnerable lines that could be disrupted by Allied naval and air power. Still, he continued to push forward. The momentum of victory created pressure, both from his own command and from higher levels of German leadership, to maintain the advance. Each success raised expectations, and with those expectations came greater risk. At the same time, Rommel's relationship with the broader German command structure began to show tension. While he was effective in the field, his style often conflicted with the more rigid, centralized control preferred by Berlin. Orders from above did not always match the reality on the ground, and Rommel was known to act independently when he believed it was necessary. This approach brought results, but it also created friction. As the war expanded, those tensions would become more significant. Decisions made far from the battlefield would begin to shape what was possible in North Africa, often limiting Rommel's ability to operate the way he had before. The war was becoming larger, more complex, and harder to control, not just for Rommel, but for everyone involved. Meanwhile, the Allies were adapting. Early setbacks had forced British forces to reassess their approach, bringing in new leadership, improving coordination, and strengthening supply networks. What had once been a reactive defense was slowly becoming more organized and more capable of responding to Rommel's tactics. Reinforcements arrived, equipment improved, and strategies began to evolve. The balance of power in North Africa was shifting, even if it was not yet fully visible on the battlefield. For Rommel, this meant that the kind of war he had dominated early on was beginning to change. The environment was no longer one where speed and surprise alone could guarantee success. New variables were entering the equation: logistics, coordination, and decisions made beyond his control. As 1942 approached, the situation in North Africa stood at a turning point. Rommel remained a dangerous and capable commander, but the conditions that had allowed him to thrive were starting to erode. The desert, once an advantage, was becoming a limitation. The enemy, once disorganized, was becoming more structured, and the war itself was expanding beyond the scope of any single commander's influence. What lay ahead was not another series of fast-moving victories, but something far more difficult, a conflict shaped by forces that Rommel could no longer fully control. By mid-1942, Rommel's forces had pushed deep into North Africa, driving Allied troops back across Libya and into Egypt. What had begun as a series of bold maneuvers had turned into a sustained offensive, one that placed German and Italian units closer than ever to one of the most strategically important objectives in the region, the Suez Canal. For Rommel, the opportunity was clear. If he could break through British defenses and seize control of Egypt, it would disrupt Allied supply lines, weaken their position in the Middle East, and potentially shift the balance of the war in the region. The momentum was still on his side, and despite growing logistical concerns, he continued to press forward. Each kilometer gained brought him closer to his objective, but it also stretched his resources further. Fuel shortages became more frequent, replacement parts were harder to obtain, and supply convoys faced increasing pressure from Allied air and naval forces. Still, Rommel chose to advance, believing that speed and decisive action could compensate for these growing limitations. The deeper his forces moved into Egypt, the more difficult the situation became. The desert, which had once provided freedom of movement, now worked against him. Long distances between supply points slowed operations, and the lack of reliable infrastructure made resupply increasingly unpredictable. Meanwhile, Allied forces were no longer reacting in the same way they had earlier in the campaign. Under new leadership, British troops began to stabilize their defensive lines, choosing positions more carefully and preparing for a sustained confrontation rather than a rapid retreat. One of those positions was near a railway halt known as El Alamein. It was not a large or well-known location, but its geography made it critical. To the north was the Mediterranean Sea, and to the south, impassable desert terrain. This created a narrow corridor where large-scale maneuvering was limited. For the first time, Rommel would not be able to rely on wide flanking movements to outmaneuver his opponent. The battlefield itself had changed. Despite these constraints, Rommel launched an attack, hoping to break through before Allied defenses could fully solidify. The fighting that followed was intense and costly. German and Italian forces pushed forward, attempting to find weak points in the British line, but the resistance they encountered was far more organized than before. Artillery fire, defensive positions, and coordinated counterattacks slowed the advance. Progress became measured in small gains rather than sweeping movements. The speed that had defined Rommel's earlier successes was gone. Every attempt to move forward required time, resources, and coordination that were becoming harder to maintain. At the same time, the limitations of his supply situation became impossible to ignore. Units reported shortages of fuel and ammunition, forcing commanders to make difficult decisions about when and where to commit their forces. What made the situation even more challenging was that many of these problems were beyond Rommel's control. Requests for additional supplies were sent back through the chain of command. But the realities of the wider war meant that those requests could not always be met. The Mediterranean remained contested, and Allied control of the air and sea made it difficult for supplies to reach North Africa in sufficient quantities. Decisions made far from the desert about priorities, resource allocation, and strategy were now directly affecting the outcome of the campaign. For a commander who had built his success on control, speed, and flexibility, this was a fundamental shift. As the battle around El Alamein continued, it became clear that the nature of the war in North Africa had changed. This was no longer a campaign defined by rapid advances and sudden breakthroughs. It was becoming a battle of endurance where logistics, positioning, and sustained pressure would determine the outcome. Rommel, who had once dictated the pace of the conflict, now found himself constrained by factors he could not fully influence. The war he had once controlled was beginning to slip beyond his grasp. As the fighting around El Alamein intensified, it became clear that Rommel was facing a fundamentally different kind of battle, one that could not be won through speed alone. His earlier campaigns had relied on rapid movement, surprise attacks, and the ability to outmaneuver his opponents across open terrain. But here, those advantages were largely gone. The narrow corridor between the Mediterranean Sea and the impassable Qattara Depression limited movement, forcing both sides into a more direct confrontation. For Rommel, this meant engaging in a battle of attrition, something his forces were not well positioned to sustain. Supplies were already stretched thin, and every day of fighting consumed resources that could not easily be replaced. Fuel shortages limited mobility, ammunition had to be carefully rationed, and mechanical failures became more frequent as equipment was pushed beyond its limits. At the same time, Allied forces were growing stronger. Under the command of Bernard Montgomery, British and Commonwealth troops began preparing for a large-scale offensive designed not just to hold the line, but to break through it. Unlike earlier in the campaign, where responses had often been reactive, this time the Allies were planning deliberately and systematically. Reinforcements arrived in increasing numbers, bringing fresh troops, improved equipment, and a steady flow of supplies. Tanks, artillery, and aircraft were assembled in quantities that began to outweigh what Rommel could bring to the field. More importantly, the Allies had time to plan, time to coordinate, and time to build an advantage that would not depend on a single moment of opportunity. This shift in approach removed one of Rommel's greatest strengths, the ability to exploit weaknesses before they could be reinforced. Rommel understood the danger. Reports from the front made it clear that the Allied buildup was significant and that an offensive was coming. Yet his options were limited. A full retreat would mean abandoning ground that had been fought for over months, while an attack risked exhausting his already strained forces. Caught between these choices, he continued to hold his position, attempting to reinforce his defensive lines and prepare for what was coming. Mines were laid, defensive positions strengthened, and units reorganized to maximize what limited resources were available. But even with these preparations, the imbalance was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The Allies had the advantage in numbers, supply, and positioning, while Rommel's forces were operating under constant constraint. When the Allied offensive finally began in late October 1942, the scale of the attack confirmed Rommel's concerns. Artillery barrages lit up the desert, followed by coordinated advances designed to break through Axis defenses. The pressure was immediate and sustained. Unlike earlier engagements, where attacks could be countered with rapid maneuvers, this was a methodical push forward, supported by overwhelming firepower. Axis forces fought back, launching counterattacks and attempting to hold key positions, but each effort came at a cost. Losses mounted, and the ability to respond weakened with each passing day. The battle was no longer about gaining ground. It was about holding on for as long as possible. For Rommel, the reality was becoming unavoidable. The war he had once controlled, through bold decisions and fast movement, had transformed into something far less predictable and far more difficult to influence. The outcome would not be decided by a single maneuver or a sudden breakthrough, but by sustained pressure and resources, two factors that were increasingly out of his reach. The battle at El Alamein was no longer a contest of tactics alone. It was a confrontation between two different approaches to war, and for the first time, Rommel was on the side that could not dictate how it would be fought. As the Allied offensive gained momentum, the pressure on Rommel's forces became impossible to ignore. Defensive lines that had been carefully prepared were beginning to crack under sustained artillery fire and repeated assaults. Units that had once been capable of coordinated counterattacks were now struggling to hold their positions. Fuel shortages had reached critical levels, limiting mobility and making it difficult to reposition forces where they were needed most. Tanks were abandoned not because they were destroyed, but because they could no longer move. Ammunition was running low, and reinforcements were no longer arriving in sufficient numbers to replace the growing losses. The battlefield was no longer one where Rommel could adapt freely. It was becoming a place where every decision was constrained by factors beyond his control. At the same time, the situation at the highest levels of command introduced an even greater challenge. Orders from Adolf Hitler were clear. There would be no retreat. The position at El Alamein was to be held at all costs. For Rommel, this directive stood in direct conflict with the reality he was facing on the ground. He understood that holding the line indefinitely was not possible. The longer his forces remained in place under increasing pressure, the greater the risk that they would be surrounded and destroyed. A controlled withdrawal, though difficult, could preserve what remained of his army and allow for a regrouping further west. But such a decision would mean defying direct orders from the highest authority in Germany, a move that carried significant personal and professional risk. Caught between these opposing realities, Rommel faced one of the most difficult decisions of his career. His experience as a commander told him that the situation required flexibility and adaptation. The conditions of the battlefield had changed, and continuing to follow a rigid plan would only lead to greater losses. Yet the structure of command within which he operated left little room for independent action in moments like this. The war, which he had once shaped through rapid decisions and bold maneuvers, was now dictating his choices in ways he could not easily alter. Every hour that passed without a change in strategy increased the danger to his forces. As Allied troops continued to push forward, the gaps in the Axis defenses widened. Breakthroughs began to occur, forcing units to fall back in disorder or risk being cut off entirely. Communication between different elements of the front became more difficult, and coordination broke down under the pressure. The situation was no longer stable. It was deteriorating. Rommel could see that the line would not hold, regardless of orders. The question was no longer whether a retreat would happen, but when and at what cost. Eventually, the reality of the battlefield forced a decision. Despite the directive to hold position, Rommel began organizing a withdrawal, prioritizing the survival of his remaining forces over strict adherence to orders. It was not a clean or easy process. Retreating under pressure required careful timing, coordination, and the ability to move quickly despite limited resources. Units had to disengage while still under fire, leaving behind equipment that could not be transported. The risk of collapse remained constant, but for Rommel, the alternative, remaining in place until destruction, was no longer acceptable. In that moment, The nature of the war became clear in a way it had not been before. This was no longer a conflict that could be controlled through individual decisions alone. It was shaped by larger forces, logistics, strategy, and command, structures that even the most capable commanders could not fully overcome. Rommel had spent much of the war operating on his own terms, adapting to changing conditions and exploiting opportunities as they appeared. Now he was being forced to act within limits he could not escape. The war he faced was no longer one he could control. As Rommel's forces began their withdrawal from El Alamein, the scale of the situation became impossible to ignore. What had once been a confident advance toward Egypt had turned into a long and difficult retreat across North Africa. The movement westward was not a strategic repositioning. It was a necessity. Allied forces, strengthened and organized, continued to push forward with increasing pressure, making it clear that holding ground was no longer an option. German and Italian units moved as quickly as their limited resources allowed, but the same problems that had weakened them during the advance now made retreat even more difficult. Fuel shortages slowed convoys, damaged equipment had to be abandoned, and constant air attacks from Allied aircraft turned every movement into a risk. The desert, which had once offered freedom of maneuver, now exposed retreating forces to continuous observation and attack. For Rommel, the reality of the campaign had changed completely. The initiative he had once held was gone, replaced by a constant need to react. Decisions were no longer about where to strike, but how to avoid collapse. Each position held during the retreat bought time, but also came with the risk of encirclement. Units fought delaying actions, attempting to slow the Allied advance while preserving as much of their strength as possible. But even these efforts had limits. The imbalance in resources, fuel, equipment, and reinforcements was too great to overcome. What had once been a campaign defined by bold movement had become a struggle for survival under conditions that could not be controlled. The war Rommel now faced was shaped less by tactics and more by constraints he could not escape. Beyond the battlefield, the broader strategic situation continued to shift. Allied control of the Mediterranean made it increasingly difficult for Axis forces to receive supplies, while new American involvement brought additional pressure to the region. The North African campaign was no longer an isolated front. It had become part of a larger war effort that combined naval, air, and ground operations in a coordinated way. For Rommel, this meant that even successful defensive actions could not change the overall direction of the conflict. The decisions that shaped the campaign were no longer his to influence. They were being made at a scale far beyond the desert, where industrial capacity, logistics, and long-term strategy determined what was possible. In the months that followed, Axis forces continued to fall back across Libya and into Tunisia, where the final phase of the North African campaign would take place. The outcome was no longer in doubt. The early victories that had defined Rommel's reputation had been overtaken by a reality he could not reverse. His ability to lead, adapt, and make bold decisions remained, but it was no longer enough to overcome the growing strength of the Allied forces. The war had evolved into something larger than any single commander, and even one of the most capable leaders of the conflict could not change its direction alone. Looking back, Rommel's experience in North Africa reveals a broader truth about the nature of war. Success can depend on speed, skill, and decision-making, but it can also be undone by factors that lie beyond the battlefield. Logistics, supply lines, and strategic priorities often shape outcomes as much as any tactical victory. Rommel had thrived in a war he could influence, where movement and initiative created opportunities, but at El Alamein, and in the retreat that followed, he faced a different kind of conflict, one defined by limits rather than possibilities. It was the moment when the war stopped being something he could control and became something he had to endure.